Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster and beyond. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. Also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning to you.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist who advises politicians from across the political spectrum. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Lovely to have you both here for what is going to be something of a tariff-focused special today. Of course, Donald Trump's tariffs have taken effect. More on that to come, including with our guest, Lord Harrington, who we'll introduce onto the podcast in just a moment or two. Of course, as you're listening or watching, you can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Whitehall with any comments or questions you might have, or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com to get in touch. Right, Donald Trump, President Trump, seems to be pushing the world into a full-blown trade war, defying market turmoil, is how the FT writes it today, as sweeping tariffs against dozens of US trading partners come into effect. He's called these reciprocal tariffs, which came into force at midnight in Washington on Wednesday. And at this point, they include a 104% levy on China, which will surely harm trade between the world's two largest economies. Kirsty, let's come to you first on this. I think one of my observations on this is that these tariffs do feel quite real. Sometimes economic policy can feel quite abstract and distant, but actually these tariffs are having an impact on things like pension values or stocks and shares ISAs that we can all look at on our phones and go, hang on a second, this is affecting my own personal wealth or savings or my business or whatever. We are feeling the reality of this particular Trump policy decision.
Yeah, we can see it playing out in real time every time we dare open our eyes and look at the stock markets across the world, right? And see those graphs that look like someone's having heart failure every kind of couple of days. Look, I mean, this policy is as moronic as it is malign. It is not. It has nothing to do with, reciprocal tariffs at all. It is a numbskull formula that makes absolutely no sense at all. Has no bearing on the tariffs imposed. No bearing on whether a country is supposedly an ally of America or not. It has seen trillions wiped off stock markets. It has caused widespread fear right across the globe. It raises the risk of soaring inflation in America, and it raises all kinds of problems in this country, not least the chances that we'll get a load of goods, cheap goods dumped on us because they can't now no longer be sent to America because nobody can afford to trade with America anymore. So it is, I can't begin to wrap my arms around how catastrophic it is. There is some signs that even some within the Trump inner circle are beginning to turn on him. The billionaire hedge fund manager Bill Ackman has warned that this will cause an economic nuclear winter, and it is a disastrous policy. Obviously, we've seen Musk beginning to decouple himself from Trump on this. We're still waiting for the Republicans to grow a spine, join the Democrats in Congress and try and stop this and try and beat that veto power that Trump has threatened. But like I say, I'm running out of hyperbole for how disastrous this is, not just for America, but for the world and for Britain.
Joe, a thought from you on this, and I want to put some comments from the president to you. So he was speaking at a Republican event, was President Trump seemingly mocking other world leaders, and forgive me for using unparliamentary language, but he told guests at this event that other world leaders are, quote, kissing my ass while negotiating deals. And I suppose that gives away the motivation behind Trump's tariffs, that he wants deals and he wants to come out on top of all of this. Doesn't sound like the most diplomatic or friendly language when it comes to actually making those deals, though.
No, it doesn't. But it also feels just very personally driven. It doesn't sound like it's got any economic sort of, I suppose, sort of, basis. There seems to be the numbers that have been come up with have, they're back of fag packet calculations, if they're calculations at all. They just seem to be numbers that effectively plucked out of thin air because the rationale for them has been questioned. But also, we've seen a lot of speculation about the motivation for this. We've seen sort of China being hit particularly hard because potentially he's still upset about what happened with COVID and how it affected his first term, and that he sees China as needing to sort of pay for what damage was done to him personally. And this just this feels like a massive vanity project and a huge gamble, which, let's face it, the whole world is going to be subject to. But not only that, the Republicans themselves are basically behind what's going on. They're not stopping it, as Kirsty said, but they're also gambling their political futures on this paying off in the long run. And there's real echoes of those people that sort of blindly followed Liz Truss with the stuff that she was doing in the UK, and sort of, well, it's the policy and that's what we're doing, and it's all going to be fine in the end. But how long do you give it to decide if it's going to be fine? There's talk of, do we wait for midterms in 2 years? And it's like, there's no way the world can wait that long. So I think we are in this extraordinary situation of, watching world leaders, who's going to do what. Keir Starmer's keeping his powder dry and being incredibly careful, but there's no question that the pressure on world leaders generally will grow, and certainly in the UK will grow, for exactly what is going to be done to help the UK economy when we're faced with such chaos elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, for expert insight on all of this, let's welcome Lord Harrington, Richard Harrington, the chair of Make UK, the manufacturers' organisation. He was MP for Watford from 2010 to 2019. He's also held several ministerial positions. He was a Minister of State at the Department for Work and Pensions and was Minister for Business and Industry from 2017 to 2019. Lord Harrington, Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
Really good to have you here. I mean, Kirsty and Joe have used words like moronic, malign, this is a vanity project for Trump. How would you describe what we are witnessing right now?
Well, yes. I mean, Joe's used such words to me before about myself, so I wouldn't take that too seriously, Calum. But they're right. Kirsty, of course, Kirsty and Joe are completely right. But, at school, I had this history teacher. And you're going to excuse this impression, I hope, Calum, because he'd know your history, laddie. And actually,
right.
If you read Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson, I don't suggest all 3 volumes unless you take a year's sabbatical, but the bit where he was running the Senate in the 30s is this. It's exactly the same isolationism. It's exactly the same America First, MAGA. And I'm afraid history does repeat itself. I hope not absolutely, because we all know where that policy of world depression ended up. But I'm afraid that there is precedent for this. And, but for Americans, I've been to 43 states in the US, and, I was there for quite a bit when I was in business when I was younger. Most people have never heard of a tariff before this. They're conditioning the public to the word tariff, which they don't know what it is and they don't know the implications. But I will say one thing. In America, people are obsessed with their pensions. It's not like here. They've all got, this is before even apps and things. Everybody knew what their 401k was, what stocks and shares were in it. Whereas the British middle class dinner conversation is always about the price of the houses, and they know every house price in their street. Well, with Americans, it is what's in their pension fund. And I think the whiplash will come very quickly from that, and that's not just a few billionaires and everything else.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I don't think anyone can understand quite the consequences of this, because really it's like since Bretton Woods after the Second World War, it basically brought a system in which, for better or for worse, we've all lived by for most of our parents' generation, let alone ours, and it has all changed where the whole system can be completely upturned. The people I worry, I do worry about people generally. Most recessions and depressions, well, things like, for example, the economic crash of 2008. Well, it wasn't really retail for the general public. There was a big panic, and then the governments took steps to rescue the banks throughout the world. By a few weeks later, it was more or less forgotten about, and the stock market started to climb and everything again. So we've not known in living memory for most people what a real shock from a retail, in a private member of the public, the effect is going to have on them. And I think this is going to be one of those.
And to what extent is there a short-term, long-term consideration? So we are reeling. These things are officially hours old. The conversation about them is several weeks old now. But will this be a short-term shock? Could this be a particularly long-term shock that we experience?
I think it's going to be a long-term shock for the reasons I've given, because it changes things. Because even if, although Trump himself I don't believe all this about third-term stuff. I actually believe he and his rich mates have conspired all this together to crash the markets and everything else. And I'm sure they'll all be taking huge stakes in whatever companies and stuff at the floor of the market, and I'm sure there'll be some divvy up at the end of it, because it will recover. Things always do recover. That's just a cynical view. There's all sorts of views as to the logic and rationale behind this. But I do think the thing is, people, it'll be a long time before they trust the United States again. Even if Trump's out, even if there's a crisis because the public don't like it in America, and there's the midterms that Joe referred to, I do think this fundamental thing of a lack of trust for the United States, who can turn on its closest friends. Absolutely, no one could be closer than Canada or the UK, or indeed the EU for that matter. And I think that's a real fundamental thing, and it will take generations to change that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, the relationship question. And on that then, I note this from the Times this morning. Giorgia Meloni, who's the Italian Prime Minister, is going to try to act as something of a bridge between the US and the EU. She's visiting President Trump on the 17th of April. And the suggestion is that she will propose the dropping of all tariffs by both the EU and the US that affect each other, which is an idea backed by the EU Commission head Ursula von der Leyen. There is an extent to which leaders are now dancing to the tune of Donald Trump. I mean, is that a healthy response, that what is being proposed there by Meloni and von der Leyen?
But Calum, I think it's been mentioned before. I don't think Trump's got any interest in this at all, because he's like the British Brexiteers. They pretend to be free trade, strutting up and down, oh, we like free trade. They're not. They're 19th century mercantilists, like we had in the UK then. They don't really want free trade. They actually want their country to have a big advantage over everybody else. So I don't think Giorgia Meloni's offer will take very much of an impact whatsoever. Most right-wing politicians are free traders until it comes to their country being affected. I mean, we had the classic case of all the Brexit lot whinging on and on about free trade. And then I remember the blue passport issue came up, which was a big thing to them. When there was a thought of a French company getting the prospect of printing them because they were cheaper. Oh no, we can't have that, because they're protectionists, and Trump's a protectionist. So I think whatever Giorgia Meloni does or says is completely irrelevant to the psyche of what Trump's really after.
Yeah, I mean, we had all this, didn't we, with Netanyahu, who went to the White House and came saying, we will drop all our tariffs on you, and all we're asking in return is that you take our 19% tariff slap and turn it down to 10%. And Trump said no. So, look, it doesn't matter how you play Trump at the moment. He will play whatever game he wants to play with this. I mean, the idea that we got 10% in Britain because Starmer has played this right is a nonsense. This is a straightforward, albeit completely bananas, calculation about how these tariffs have come to be, where we happen to be on the lucky side of it. We could have just as easily not been. It is just a calculation. But Rich, can I ask you, just in terms of what you think Trump is up to, because it can't be two things at the same time. It cannot be about one day you're saying, oh, this is about, I've got loads of people coming to me wanting to do a deal, they're talking about deals, we're going to negotiate great deals. It cannot be about deals and at the same time being about reviving more manufacturing in the United States and bringing trillions of dollars into the United States through tariffs. It can't be both of these things at the same time, right?
You're right. And there's a whole industry of people who are trying to guess what's really in his mind. I suppose in the end, it's about his belief that, well, what he's promised his electorate, which is this fantasy of bringing back all these blue-collar jobs. And I don't think this art that everyone's read this book, which she didn't write anyway, called The Art of the Deal. this isn't like a New York real estate deal. And by the way, it had a terrible reputation in New York real estate circles, really bad. I think it is this fantasy of bringing back blue-collar jobs to the United States. That's the whole MAGA thing. And I think that's far more dangerous than the second option. But I hope it is the second option. I think we all do, that it is deals and deals and deals. But I don't think so. Do you agree,
and also
Jeff? Do you agree, Kirsty?
Well, also a fantasy, because the vast majority of those jobs that might have been there in the the 50s or the 30s, a lot of those are automated now. So even if in the long haul you brought back more industry, the idea that that converts necessarily to the same amount of number of jobs that it would have done pre-automate, automation is for the birds, right?
That's right. And I think Joe Biden, who obviously now is talked of as if he was the devil incarnate, but what he did with the IRA, which was to really incent companies to start, moving plant and such like to the United States, to me, that was, from an American point of view, a very sensible strategy, because it wasn't a burn everything else strategy. But Trump has, he's completely rubbished that and come into what's this total kamikaze view. And I agree with you, Kirsty. I think it's complete fantasy.
It's interesting, Richard, that you bring up that point about the IRA, and obviously you were behind the report that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak asked you to do on investment, and obviously now I wonder what your view is of the sort of potential investment opportunities, not only globally, but you spoke to a lot of businesses when you did that report, and you gave some clear recommendations. We've only seen today about this new theme park opening in Bedford. And funnily enough, we learned a couple of days ago that Luton Airport was having its expansion approved. And that was, some of the stuff that you looked at was about what levers can government be behind to help encourage investment. But we also saw this government coming in with a almost very gloomy picture about the prospects for the UK, which potentially put off investment. So where do you see this tariff war, this global trade war, leaving businesses that are looking at what to do next? Do you think there is an opportunity that the UK could seize?
Well, I think you're going to get a classic politician's answer, Joe, which is not a straight answer, because there isn't one. But as far as the review's concerned, you're right. We interviewed about 200 companies, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, either those that had invested in the UK, if so, why, and those that hadn't, like AstraZeneca, for example, and why they went abroad. And some of those things are still very valid today. That is, lack of consistency of policy, completely changing policy within one political party 3 or 4 times. Like, for example, on the road to net zero automotives, which changed from 2050 to 2030 to 2035. That's one of them. And the second one, which is again fairly fundamental, is the fact that generally they felt the British government had messed them around, and it took 14 months for AstraZeneca to know whether they were going to get a few £1 million towards a 1.1 billion deal. And then there's a lot of things that came with that. But what is relevant today is that, yes, the British government have really tried to get their act together, in so much that they've got a much more senior investment minister who reports to the Treasury as well. They've got an industrial strategy which is about to be published, which provides the kind of guidelines as to where we're going to prioritise our investments, which was scrapped by Boris and Rishi, the last one. I should declare my interest as one of the co-authors to the last one, and it was scrapped, and I thought it was a great tragedy. However, it is being brought back. But then they're doing their best to reorganise the system of government, so there's a concierge service for prospective investors and all this kind of stuff. All those things, there have been improvement. However, if Calum used what he would call unparliamentary language, which I think he referred to another word for Donald Trump's bottom, I can't quite remember.
Yes,
but I'm going to use
correct.
one of my favourite expressions, which is, you can't make chicken salad out of chicken shit. Which basically means however you do the organisation, however you sort out the concierge service and everything else, if the basic product is not there, you can distribute and market as much as you like. As the Conservatives found, John Major spent far more money than Tony Blair on the 97 election. The Conservatives spent far more money than Labour on the last election, but you can't distribute a product that people don't want to buy. So do they want to buy the British product in the event of tariffs, and turmoil in the rest of the world? The plus argument is, well, we could sneak between the middle because we're not part of the European Union, and investors will look to us as a safe haven. And, we will have political stability. At least we've got one government for the next 4 or 5 years, etc. So there are quite a lot of plus points. But when you look at the fundamental minus points, the Americans aren't frightened of us. They are frightened of the EU. The EU is their biggest trading bloc. All this blustering about Trump doesn't like the EU. Believe me, as the Americans say, money talks and bullshit walks, and they're much more likely to do a better deal with the EU than they are with us. Having said that, I think there is an opportunity for us. We've got thousands and thousands of scientists and research people are leaving the United States. That they really are. They've cut R&D spending down, the same R&D spending that's brought most of the major drugs to a level of development that the big drug companies can then produce them economically. That's gone. Everyone's after those scientists, including China, who's offering them brilliant research facilities in Guangzhou and English language and big salaries and all that. We need to be there. And if we stop this anti-immigration nonsense, which has taken control of everybody and had really good visas to get these people to come with incentives, tax-free incentives and this sort of thing, we could become a magnet for people who've been shaken out by Trump. Americans who are perhaps not the billionaires, zillionaires, but they want to come here, they don't like Trump, they speak the language, they feel comfortable here and everything like that. But that means bringing back an equivalent of the non-dom system, which the Conservatives, for some reason, because Rishi didn't want his wife to be, political thing, because his wife was non-dom, but the ramification of that doubled down by Labour means that, as we know, tens of thousands of people are left. We're going to have a new system to attract people like that, and a very slick government approach to investment, which does mean coming up with money, because other countries are throwing money at companies and sectors that they want to attract to their areas. So I do think there's an opportunity. I do take the optimist view of the two that I've laid out, but there's a lot of work to be done.
I like the optimistic view. I am all for Starmer being calm in a crisis. I obviously don't think retaliatory tariffs are the way forward. Why double down on stupidity with stupidity of our own? So fine. I'm a little bit concerned about the kind of pace and scale of the government's response at the moment. There's a difference between being calm and me wanting to get the defib pads out to check that the man is still alive, to the scale of what we now face. And so we've had some tweaking of, frankly, ridiculously onerous costs and regulations that were passed onto the EV market. In any event, do we need to be more radical? We've got massive tariffs on our car industry, massive tariffs on the steel industry. There's a question about nationalising of the steel in Scunthorpe. And obviously Trump is now threatening to come for the pharmaceuticals industry as well with higher tariffs. And our response so far is keep calm and carry on. We've got this big trading bloc, CPTPP, if I've got that right. We've got reset talks with the EU. Is this the time? We've got no money. Whatever tiny headroom that Rachel Reeves had bolted in has presumably long since gone, since last week. But we've got extra taxes on businesses. We've got, a government still threatening to put more workers' burdens on businesses as well. Do we need to be more radical? Do we need a radical reset with EU? Do we need new trading, radical reboost of our trading with CPTPP partners? What is it that we should be doing that we're not at the moment?
I think you've just been through it all, Kirsty. All of the above. A radical new approach to regulation. And if they look at the obstacles, look at where we've gone wrong. And all this was mentioned in the review I did. Regulation takes far too long and under-resourced. And they're compounding it with new workers' rights stuff, which is completely unnecessary, given that I think most sensible people would agree that the days of workers being exploited by the capitalist classes have long since gone. My parents met at a Young Communist League dance in 1955. I think we've moved on since then. That nonsense has to stop. bureaucracy that doesn't work, like building safety regulation, which is holding up sites all over the UK for developers who want to comply and want to be safe. Instead, it's all held up a year or two. The medicines regulator, who are under-resourced and need a high-speed way of doing stuff, they don't. I mean, we could go through things like that are within the government's power. And I think Pat McFadden, who is I call him Captain Sensible because he is a very decent person. I think they're on it, but we've now got to take drastically quick measures to show investors from all over the world that things are changing. So yes, I think those things, there are those radical things that need to be done. Whilst behind the scenes, I'm sure there's plenty of things going on with in the US that we don't know about, discussions and this kind of stuff. But I mean, this fantasy of trade deal. You remember the nonsense that Boris, with his oven-ready trade deal, as a part of the lies that people were told about Brexit. That was, oh, the oven-ready trade deal, the same as the 350 million a week for the NHS and everything. Well, no, we can hodgepodge together. The trade deal is basically us lying down, saying to the Americans, whatever you want, forget the tax on your big companies, and despite the fact Google and Amazon, etc., used to pay no tax at all, they now have to pay some, or now they'll pay no tax at all, whatever you want on free street. This is now a trade deal. I don't really hold out much hope for that being realistic, but there are those things that you've mentioned which are, albeit very difficultly, they are within the scope of the UK government.
I suppose I just find the whole timeline of this fascinating. In terms of considering a UK-US trade deal, Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, was in interviews this morning. She refused to put a date on it, just saying the government's working at pace and that the government's confident it will get a US trade deal. Are we waiting for the first domino to fall in that particular procession, do you think? Because I've also been reading this morning about South Korea's ambition for a trade deal, Japan as well. It feels like there's a long queue of countries waiting for a trade deal with the US. Do we need to be at the front of that queue, or should we hold off?
I'm sure it'll be a limited type of trade deal. We might as well be at the front, Calum. But as I say, I think it's basically a capitulation. The question is to what extent. So, people forget these trade deals. I mean, remember Liz Truss, I've got a trade deal with the Faroe Islands and all this sort of rubbish, which was supposed to replace the EU. Actually, trade deals are really difficult because it's a battle of vested interests. And the American, steel manufacturers, the American farmers, these are strong vested interests. I don't blame them. Government is about democracy's a balance of vested interests, but we've got vested interests as well. And a true trade deal, the fact Boris's fantasy and everything of this trade deal with the US will be it would decimate further parts of the UK economy and the kind of standards, etc., that we've got used to. Well, that might be fine. That's for governments to decide whether they want that. But the talk that it's just, it's a few bits and pieces. We won't charge them tariffs. They won't charge us tariffs. That's a trade deal. I'm afraid that's just abject nonsense.
So, Richard, do you think when we talk about this EU reset, how far do you think we should go on this? Do you think we should let go of our fish or some of our fishing rights to France? And should we allow under 30s effectively free movement back into Britain?
Well, I would say yes to both, Kirsty, because I think the prize of a very close trading deal with the European Union is a great one. But again, that's for, Keir Starmer is paid to balance the different interest groups here and to use judgment on those things. For me, I mean, obviously I come from a background where I thought the whole thing was bonkers. To manage the Conservative Party, we had to say, okay, fine, well, our closest ally, where we influence nearly every aspect of policy, where we show power far greater than any one country can do, that's gone because we all think it's the 19th century again, and really we're superior to that lot because we're better than they are and we can rule the world. No, I don't buy all that. And anything to take away that and incrementally move towards a closer tie with what should be is our biggest trading partner, for me would be great. So I am a bit biased, but in the short term, it can only be done incrementally, and anything that really moves towards that, that's fine. But there are trade-offs. There's always trade-offs.
Yeah. And obviously, I can't find anybody that doesn't think that come the next budget, Rachel Reeves won't come back for more spending cuts, more tax rises now. Is there a world where British business can take any more of the tax burden in light of what is going on now?
No, I think they know that in our conversations with the Chancellor and the business secretary. This is with my Make UK hat. They're very aware of that. But I do think there'll be an increase in taxes. I think it's going to be property taxes. I think there will be a much higher rate of taxation on more expensive properties, which is cheap and easy to collect and unavoidable. And those nasty foreigners that we really don't like because we're British, they will have to pay more on their properties as well. And I do think that that's the sort of last bit that's really undertaxed, and I would put a bet on that coming in.
A revival of the mansion tax.
Yeah, and actually, what's holding back a lot of property at the moment is the stamp duty and the transaction. I think it's better to do it on an annual basis and try and get more liquidity into the market by removing stamp duty and stuff like that. But again, it's a trade-off. But they will have to raise more money, won't they, as you pointed out, Kirsty? And I think that's the least painful way of doing it.
Richard, one last point from me, that you were business minister when, well, I mean, UK Steel has had a lot of challenges over the years, but you were also business minister when having to deal with that a lot. And obviously it's been front and centre of the discussion in the last few weeks. And I wonder sort of if you feel, you're obviously on the board of you're chairing the board of Make UK, so you have a perspective from that position as well. But having had the business brief, do you feel that the government's got a plan? Do you feel that do you think there is an answer that can save, UK Steel for the UK? Or do you think it is something that is just too problematic for governments to really get into?
The answer is political, and that is it? It's a very legitimate political decision. Do we need a primary steel facility in the United Kingdom? In the same way, do we need agriculture? For reasons, because we can, I'm sure, import most products that from abroad that are much cheaper and better, wheat and all that kind of stuff. But governments have taken, I think quite rightly, the view that for security reasons we need agriculture. If you take that view with steel, which I do, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? We have to accept the fact that it is going to involve quite a lot of public money, because the reason steel came up here, which was iron ore, coal, new technology in the 19th century, does not apply. There is no rational reason in the world, if you believe in the theories of comparative advantage and stuff like that, why you would produce steel. But it's a strategic one. We do have a steel industry that employs nearly 40,000 people directly and another 50,000 through the supply chain. We've got, these are high paid jobs and everything else, but we've suffered from political football, nationalisation, denationalisation, nationalisation, desperation, selling one of the main things to the Indians and the other one now to the Chinese. It's a decision, but it is going to cost money. I would argue that we cannot be the only country in the G7 that doesn't have primary steel production for security reasons, and it's we 96% of steel that we use is recycled, recovered, and recycled. I mean, there's tons of reasons to have it, but the government can't stand idly by and let the free market operate because we won't have a steel industry.
Mm. And just a final one from me, Richard, if I may. I mean, I'm looking at headlines this morning of China's retaliation against the US in this context, Europe poised to approve a retaliation plan as well. The New York Times describes for the US and China a risky game of chicken with no off-ramp in sight. Trade was the glue that had long bound China and the US together. Its unwinding could be dangerous for the world. I'm reminded of something I heard years ago. I think it's kind of a conventional wisdom thing, that free trade stops wars. And I do just wonder how serious this thing could get if this trade war continues. Could it escalate into real danger for the world?
I absolutely think so, Calum. As I said at the beginning when I mentioned Lyndon Johnson and that stuff in the 30s, that's precisely what happened.
Yeah.
It is serious. Trump is the best friend China ever had. He is a dream to China. He's throwing many countries in the world into China's hands. He's giving them carte blanche to do what they want. And I don't know, I just can't understand why he pretends it's an anti-China policy. Removing US aid, which glued together American influence throughout Africa, is basically a free advert for China. You've got a free hit in any country you want. And I don't understand why people don't see that. He's a friend of China. He's actually a friend of Russia as well. And yes, I think it's very dangerous. And I'm afraid it's quite easy to take the apocalyptic view of what it will lead to. But it's very true that that's what history says. And I started off this podcast with quoting history, and to be boring, I would do the same again.
It's not boring at all, Richard. We are very, very grateful for your expertise and your insight on this episode. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great to have Lord Harrington on the Whitehall Sources podcast this week. Joel, some reflections from you, first of all, on what we've heard from a former business minister there. I mean, I suppose his payoff was it's easy to take the apocalyptic view of all of this, but that is where a sensible person like Lord Harrington, that's where his thinking is at right now, and that should be a wake-up and a bit of an alarm bell.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when you speak the fascinating thing about Richard is that he was a Conservative MP, Conservative business minister, then did this kind of very interesting sort of move away from frontline politics because of his views on Europe, and then came back to do this Ukraine scheme when he then went into the Lords. And now he's this unaffiliated peer who is also the chair of an organisation which is representing sort of UK manufacturing. And so having someone that sort of isn't confined by the party lines is kind of quite refreshing, actually, because we often hear, the sort of no one really wants to say what's going on. No one really wants to spell out what this means. And I found it, I always find Richard very refreshing, but I think even more so when you do take that sort of politics bit out. And he was saying that, a lot of this is political. There's a lot of political decisions. There's a lot of challenges that how we respond is not just about diplomacy, but it's also about politics at home, to the point about UK Steel and what we do about that, where it leaves us in the world if we don't back UK Steel, which is something a lot of people don't really understand out there. And I think it just puts into stark focus just how complicated this is, but how also there's a constant focus from the media about what is the government doing, why isn't it doing this, shouldn't it be doing that. And you can see when the consequences of this are as apocalyptic as Richard is sort of suggesting, you can see why everyone is sort of standing back a bit to take a measured view about how to make each move, because they're almost expecting that one other country is going to do something. We saw that with China. And then what's the retaliation? What does that mean? And I think there is merit, and I hate to say it, but I do think there is merit in this concern about what this leads to, that is much bigger than trade, much bigger than economies, and more about global peace and security, because the ante has been up so much. That is the point of this. The rhetoric is it's getting pretty brutal between countries, the way they're speaking. And you can understand why, while it might be frustrating to some, I think there is some merit in the government's position of trying to be more tempered.
One of the other things, Kirsty, that Richard Harrington said, that President Trump is a best friend of China.
Yeah, look, I mean, the interesting thing about China is China has quite a lot of its own economic woes right now, and a little bit like Putin, I don't suppose President Xi can believe his luck right now in terms of what is happening. Look, I have read at least one volume of Caro's biography of Lyndon B. Johnson, because what else are you going to do during COVID and the lockdown months, right?
I was learning that weird dance, Kirsty, during
I made a lot of bread and I read Caro.
I was doing a lot of TikToky videos. So
what can I tell you? So look, those that what was the philosophical argument? Those that fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. Look, Bill Ackerman, I think we shouldn't gloss over the fact that he's talking about an economic nuclear winter, which sounds like a good old recession/depression by any measure. And I think, whilst obviously I agree with Starmer, that, it's a bit like Theresa May going, no deal is better than a bad deal. No one ever really bought the idea that Theresa May was going to go for a no deal as an option, which is why it wasn't much of a threat, any more than anyone realistically thinks that for all this consultation with business, that our response is going to be a kind of trade, a tariff war, because it's simply not going to be, because it is bonkers for them and it would be bonkers for us too. But that's not to say that I don't want them to turn up the dial a little bit on their response and get a much greater sense of urgency. The idea that we can bury our heads and hope that this will blow over, or, as I said before, the Republicans will grow a bloody spine. They have the power to stop this in its tracks, right? You need a 2/3 vote in Congress, and you can beat the veto, the Trump veto, and you can stop this in its tracks. But so far, only sort of 7 Republicans have put their heads above the parapet on it. So whilst we're all waiting for the Republican Party to grow a spine, what do we do about this? We are in the middle of reset talks with the EU. Rather than just dangling this, frankly pointless trade deal with America as if that's the solution to anything, which it won't be, and actually might make things considerably worse for a lot of businesses in Britain. We need to I would think the government needs to be starting for rolling the pitch about what a closer working relationship with the EU might look like. I get that it will have kind of Brexiteers frothing at the sides of their mouths saying, oh, well, this is Starmer's wish all along to sell us down the river and get us back into Europe by the back door. Look, we're in a crisis right now. This is our biggest trading partner. America's our second biggest. The European Union bloc is our biggest. There is an opportunity for us here. There's also an opportunity for us to turn around and do much more trading with the CPTPP partners that we have. That is a great trading bloc. I don't think that we've made the most out of that yet either. So let's start turning up the dial on this. Let's start showing it the urgency that it needs, and let's start rolling the pitch for what this actually might mean in terms of a closer working relationship, a closer trading relationship with the EU again. I don't want dynamic regulatory alignment. I'm not arguing for, going back through the back door, but there's plenty of business we can do here. But that is going to mean some trade-offs, and we're going to start to need to hear about those arguments pretty quickly.
It's a strange and uncertain and fast-moving time, this Trump presidency, isn't it? So Kirsty and Joe, thank you both very much for such clarity, and our thanks as well to Lord Harrington, our guest on the podcast today. You can email us with your thoughts. The address is hello@whitehallsources.com. Do keep in touch with us. Join the mailing list as well at whitehallsources.com, or the WhatsApp number to get in touch is 0333 404 6507, and start your message with the word Whitehall. Thank you so much for being here. We'll talk to you again soon.